this session. I hope this is okay for all of you. We're recording it so that other participants can watch the webinar afterwards as well. And also for you, it's the opportunity to share it and disseminate the webinar afterwards. This webinar will be approximately for 1 hour long. And I have the pleasure to be guiding you and moderating the session. My name is Ricarda Mocilnik, and I am working for the International Council for Adult Education as a policy and advocacy officer, as well as for the Bridge 47 network for the network team. Additionally, we are going to be streaming the webinar live on Facebook. So we will have live social media stream as well. So as mentioned already, this webinar is organized by the International Council for Adult Education in cooperation with DVV International and the Bridge 47 network. Just a very short introduction, who are all these organizations actually? So the International Council for Education is a global network advocating for youth and adult learning. It has been created already in 1973 and has seven regional bodies and representing many organizations, approximately 800 NGOs all over the world in 75 countries. Additionally, on board of this webinar series is Bridge 47. The Bridge 47 network is co-created and implemented by 15 European and global civil society organizations. And what we do is working towards a transformation towards global justice through global citizenship education. And we do this through 4 action areas. So we coordinate the global network, we advocate to change policy, so advocacy work, do a lot regarding partnership building and also, of course, building capacities. And this webinar series is based on a journal, the DVV International Journal for Adult Education and Development. And we always base this series on different kind of articles. And one of these articles was written by Haldis. And this journal of this year was focused on the professionalization in adult education. So what is actually a good adult educator? And as you can imagine, this raises more questions than answers. So what makes a good adult educator? How can we train for that? Should we make actually adult education a compulsory element of initial teacher training, and how to deal with the many teachers who are highly skilled, but who have never taken qualifications and trainings? And well, you can read the journal under the link I have posted in this PowerPoint presentation, which you of course will be receiving after this webinar here today. And many of these questions might or might not be tackled during the webinar today by our 2 speakers. So as already mentioned, Haldis Holst, she has written one of the articles of this year's journal. And to introduce to you Haldis Holst, she is the Deputy Secretary General of Education International, which represents organizations of teachers and other education employees across the world, and is the world's largest federation of unions. She is currently chair of the governing board of the European Wirtschaftscenter Center, and she serves on the board of directors of the Global Partnership of Education for Education and on the board of the Global Campaign Against Child Labor. She graduated as a teacher in 1983, and after majoring in English and physical education, she has worked as a teacher in primary and secondary schools. And our second speaker today is Joke. Joke, I didn't actually ask you how to pronounce your name properly, sorry. Joke van der Leuf-Roth.
Wonderful.
You can correct me, of course. She's a historian and the founding president and former director and currently special advisor of Euroclear, which is the European Association of History Education and Educators, and the former Secretary General of the Brussels Platform for Lifelong Learning. Her work for Euroclear concentrated primarily on international projects which focus on building bridges through history education within society and across borders. These activities supported volunteer professional development of history education practitioners based in schools, curriculum and teacher training institutions, and active as developers of teacher resources. And without further ado, I will ask Haldis to give her input. And the other participants, I would ask to write your questions, thoughts, your experiences already during the input of the two speakers in the chat box. After the inputs, after both inputs, I will open the question and answer session. So please, anytime you feel like you have a question, please write it in the chat box on your right-hand side. So thank you so much. Over to you, Haldis.
Thank you very much, Ricarda. And now well, I'm getting some help getting some pictures up on the screen here. Then I thought I'm going to start by repeating a couple of things that you said, Ricarda, about what I represent here. Basically, I'm a teacher. That's my professional background. I'm not a professional adult educator. I'm trained for primary and secondary schools, although I have done some adult education. I'm Norwegian. I see I have a countryman online here, so that's my professional background. Now it's the first, now my clicker isn't working. Just for my help left the room. Uh-oh. And I just a sec. I need help, it's not working.
It's live.
So I call for, this is what all professionals learn, is that we know something but not everything. And when it comes to technology, I need support. So there, we're going. Now this is more or less what on, for those of you that see the PowerPoint, that Ricardo already said, that Education International is a global union federation. That means that individuals cannot be a member of Education International. You can be a member of Education International if you're a member of a trade union in the education sector in your own country, which happens to be a member of Education International. We believe that we are the most representative because we are by far, if not the only global union that represents more or less the whole world. And if we count our members, we're representing more than 32 million people working in the education sector in 179 countries and territories. So the way to become a member with us is to become a member of a trade union that works in the education sector. Why don't I get, I think I'm going to need help all the way around. It's just, I'm not going to go through all our values, but our principles is that we promote the principle of quality education funded publicly and should be available to every student in every country. When we talk about education, we talk about the whole system of education, from early childhood education up through adult education, including tertiary education and vocational education. We promote and represent the interests of teachers and other education employees on the international level, which means that we do not interfere with national governments, but we work towards the cross-national international organizations like the UN organizations, like the OECD, just to mention as a couple. We have a memorandum of understanding with UNESCO, which of course is the education body of the United Nations, also work closely through the ILO, which I will come back to. And we're living now, when I come at this, I'm going to come at it from a helicopter view, because the way we see the world of education is that education is very much on the political agenda. It is, from very many perspectives, being seen as very important for all age groups, from small children up until through the full lifespan. And that can make you feel quite good, that you work in an area that is popular, that people speak about, but it also then poses challenges. because it means we're going to have the spotlight on us, that you're going to have a lot of people that think they know a lot about it and that have a legitimate right to have opinions about education. We also see that the demand is increasing for education in all its forms within the lifelong learning span. That means also that there is a great demand for teachers and other education workers. A demand that we at the moment are not able to fill. And that creates some spaces, someone to make a quick fix. How do we recruit more people? We're also working in a sector where the major costs are connected to the people who teach and wages. So the wish to cut costs, to make it cheaper, is also out there and influencing the whole sector. Why don't... I think I'm going to have to, it won't respond to my clicking. I don't know how many of you know this report. It was issued for the ILO at their centenary 1 year ago. Work for a Brighter Future, the report of the Global Commission on the Future of Work. The work on following up on this is ongoing right now, but there is a very important focus in this report. And you know, the ILO is tripartite. It has the governments, employers, and the workers. It was led by the Prime Minister of Sweden and of South Africa. They say in this, just have one quote, if we go to the next one every time I think, that a universal entitlement to lifelong learning that enables people to acquire skills and to reskill and upskill. We're talking about the world of work. That's when we have the skill term. Lifelong learning encompasses formal and informal learning from early childhood and basic education through to adult learning. Governments, workers, and employers, as well as educational institutions, have complementary responsibilities in building an effective and appropriately financed lifelong learning system, or ecosystem as they call it. This report has an enormous focus on lifelong learning. Now, I know we've been talking about lifelong learning for quite a time, but it is reminding the governments, the workers, and the employers of the world that most people are going to need to keep renewing their skills and their knowledge through life. And that it is not one person's responsibility, it's not the individual's responsibility alone, and it's not the government's responsibility alone. This is a societal responsibility. They do discuss how to deliver this. So a major focus in this report is new technology. And that, I think, is one of the areas where we'll be discussing most in the years to come. How new technology both can support us immensely. It can support us in reaching learners we haven't been able to reach before. It can support us in having tools to make education and learning processes more interactive, more interesting, more fun, all that. But it also poses some challenges, especially when technology has an aim of taking over the human aspect of teaching and learning. And that's where we get into artificial intelligence. And also, we will say sometimes we see challenges around the world where they try to script teachers from iPads or make one curriculum that is applicable everywhere, one size fits all, instead of being culturally sensitive or contextual to the area that you're going to teach in. And finding the balance of how technology can support and help us, but at the same time, not instrumentalize and to make education something that I, at least, believe it shouldn't be. It's not a mere just transferring skills from one to the other. You have to have a dialogue form of this, and it's a complex process. This is being discussed and on the agenda, and will be further discussed during the ILO conference now in June. Then, at the same time, UNESCO has just launched their Futures of Education initiative. They deliberately call it the Futures of Education because the world is diverse and people are diverse. So there are many futures that we are educating for. Those, for many of you, you will recognize or get thoughts when you see the title of the initiative, Learning to Become. At least what immediately comes into my mind is that this is not the first report from UNESCO, and it sort of comes in as, call it the fourth report in a string of reports that started back in 1971-72 with Learning to Be, the world of education today and tomorrow. And then we have the Delors report, Learning the Treasure Within, which was talking about learning to know, learning to do, learning to live together, and learning to be. And here they talk about learning to become, which is focusing on that you never stop learning. You're always on the road to become something more, further develop, and seeing education in that context. So it's a very broad notion of education. It is a notion of looking at how we're going to educate the populations of the world to meet the future challenges. If we look at the reference challenges within climate change, within democracy, living in the information societies we're living in. We have the challenge of peace that we've always had, and the big, beautiful world, the future of humanity. This has been launched quite recently. There is an international commission, now this is a screenshot of their webpage, that has been appointed. In addition, everyone can get involved. There is a place to click there to get involved, and you can give your thoughts, answer a questionnaire, give your input to what is your thought on the futures of education. They also open the opportunity to create reference groups around the world that can have discussions, that can submit their views into the Commission. And I would encourage you to take part in such a discussion, so we make sure that we get input from the broad spectrum of the education world out there. What are the challenges? Where do we want to go? What do we want to achieve for ourselves and for our students? Take the next. In all of this focus on the future of education, and all of this, of course, is in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, where we have the standalone goal on education as goal 4, but also where education is seen as a means to achieve many of the other goals, whether it's eradicating poverty, whether it's to achieve decent work, to achieve equality. There are just about all the goals have education as a means to achieve, but we also have the goal 4 in itself. To achieve all this, with education being in such demand, from early childhood through adult education, we need an enormous number of teachers and educators. We want to be very sure that we try to avoid all the shortcuts we can avoid. And one of the ways of trying to avoid shortcuts is to keep the flag high, that we cannot cut down on our quality standards, on the professionalism of those who work in the field. When you work with people, you are putting the people you work with in a vulnerable situation, and you must conduct your work to the highest possible standards. Now, Education International has had a framework of professional ethics for many years, which we do not implement in each country, but is a reference framework that we encourage countries to develop their professional ethics for specifically now for the teaching profession, not defining sectors, but the teaching profession broadly. This we have now taken a step further. And during the General Assembly of UNESCO in November of last year, we jointly launched a global framework of professional teaching standards, which is based on an ethical approach to teaching, but also to a greater extent to talking about the quality or the basics that must be present in a professional setting for educators and teachers. It is not an assessment tool. It is a reference framework for countries to develop their own. For some countries, the word standards is very negative. In other countries, standards is a positive word. We're not concerned with the word. We're concerned with that the professionals involved, the governments responsible, the organizations or the public authorities that are employers, that they together agree on that this is the quality framework we want, this is what we want to deliver to our students, young or a little bit older or old. We take the next one. I cannot go through the whole document, but it is sort of divided into 3 domains and 10 standards. And the 3 domains being teaching, knowledge, and understanding. So it's about the teachers should have the knowledge and understanding. And then you have the 3 standards of how students learn, whatever their age is. Now this can reference to one of your goals or questions of whether or not adult education should be a separate stream within training of all teachers, or should it be a specialized teacher education you can take? Because we know age is one of the criteria for how your student learns. The particular learning, social and developmental needs of their students, and that's contextual. You need to know a little bit about the background, the setting, why they're there. The content and related methodologies of the subject matter or content being taught. So it is the combination of knowing the subject, but also methodology. That teaching is a combined profession of knowing your subject and knowing how to teach. And also that it should be evidence-based in the respect that we believe that as much as possible, it should be based on research and analytical methods. Then there's the practice, that you demonstrate a certain level, that you can plan and prepare your lessons, that you have an appropriate range of activities, your pedagogy, your methodologies are there, that you can organize and facilitate the activities in the classroom, and that you have knowledge of assessment and analysis. And then we have the teaching relations, that you do not work in a silo, that you have cooperative and collaborative professional processes. And this will vary, of course, where you are in the education system, where it's natural that you cooperate, but no one should be completely on their own, that there should be a collaborative nature to it. Communication with parents, caregivers may not be so important within adult education, but you still may have an outside world to communicate with, like members of the community, employers, if it's part of their work. There can always be other partners to communicate with. And then the continuous professional development. I usually say that it should be a right for all teachers, but it should also be an obligation. If you get the right, you should also be obliged to engage in continuous professional development. That's the framework that UNESCO and Education International have agreed on, and that we now encourage countries and our member organizations to jointly discuss how can this be implemented. And in my mind, it should be relevant at least for the parts of adult education that are connected to a formal education system, but I would argue as a reference point for anyone who's engaged in learning and educating around the world. That was generally what I had thought I'd say as an introduction. In my helicopter view, how we have to relate to what's going on there to try to create a reference point for those who are on the ground in the country. There's the future, there's the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals going on. We had the future of work discussion, where there's going to be a lot of reskilling, upskilling, retraining. You have the futures of education. What do we really want education and lifelong learning to be? And we have a lot of actors that want to be part of a gigantic education market, both nonprofit, for-profit, and public. I rest my case.
Thank you so much, Alice. Thanks for this very insightful presentation. And before opening the floor for questions from the participants, I'm sure that they have lots of questions, in particular on the framework. I'm handing over to Joke, and I'm curious to hear your reaction and thoughts. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Thank you for having the opportunity to react and also to listen to Haldis about how this international framework operates in education. And I totally agree with her how important it is to work with teachers. And what I see in her contribution, and what I also notice is, yes, we all are very much concerned at the moment with education and teachers, and we hear that very much from international organizations. She mentioned UNESCO. I've been very much involved in the work of the Council of Europe and the European Union. There we see a lot happening, but then when it comes to national level, as she already mentioned, then it's much more difficult, and you see that implementing all these good ideas into real practice is another issue. And as mentioned, it's quite often related very much to the budgets of countries, and we have seen that they are mostly not so much growing. So here I totally agree, and I'm very happy that Education International is such a hard worker to make everybody aware of this issue. I find it very interesting, and I also was reading that in the article, the internationalization of this whole story. Where I come from, which is predominantly from history, citizenship, and also heritage, we notice how much importance there is for this internationalization, not only to sort of inspire organizations, but really directly inspire people to work together. And I believe that therefore Education International is very important, but I think in general, it's very important to work together as we have done and do in the Lifelong Learning Platform, and of course also in Euroclio. Certainly if we look at the moment in this rise of political extremism, I think that we really have to show that going back into our countries is not the solution for the world, and that we really have to have cross-border dialogue, understanding and cooperation. And that's one of the things my organization, Euroclio, is working for already for a long time. And certainly also shares that idea, what also was mentioned by Haldis, that education has a strong ethical point, what we work for. And in my organization, we thought that the sort of slogan, what is also used for the UNESCO, that we have to work for peace, is one of the issues we really share and stand for. And we have done that via adult learning. And it's interesting that my organization is very much working on two levels. In a way, we are adult educators, but we are also adult learners, as a lot of our work is based on peer learning, working together. And yes, I agree here again with Haldis, it's a responsibility of an educator, and it's also a right of an educator to be involved in lifelong learning and to develop into a high quality trainer, but also to involve yourself. And for us, that choice of individuals, I think that's really different from Education International, is that we have been focusing through member organizations, but still on the individual making the choice and based on the needs they formulated. And I think that is one of the things why I like so very much your global framework, because in a way it helps teachers to see the basics of a teacher profession. I quite often, you see that people are interested in learning, and then yes, they are interested in what their subject tells them, but the nice point of your framework is really that it brings in this sort of 10 different elements, which really you can see that, okay, that is what I as a teacher should be dealing with. And the good thing is also that it doesn't take away the fact that knowledge and understanding of the subject is important, that's certainly, but it's embedded in a bigger framework. And for me, very interesting was that when I came, this document came to my notice, it was through our preparation for this event, I posted it and it was shared immediately by many. And that I think is one of the lovely things also for this sort of webinars, that we come to the knowledge to the things we didn't know about in an earlier stage. I would say that I believe very much in what we call adult education, because I think that yes, we see not enough, still not enough real activity in countries. I mean, I see that everywhere, that yeah, if there is adult education, it's very much focused on a need which comes up in a sort of hype. All of a sudden, everybody has to deal with issues. But therefore, I believe very much that it's important to see also adult education as something that people take from themselves, that they really are able as a teacher, and there the framework really helps to sort of see who am I now and where are my gaps and how can I get better in that sort of thing. So that's a bit my reaction on what you have been saying. It's always difficult to react immediately on the issues, but I let's say one of my biggest concerns, and perhaps you can give an answer to that, Haldis, is also that we in an international context are dealing with so many issues related to education. And yes, you mentioned quite some reports from UNESCO, and you can add that from Council of Europe, from EU, from OECD or whatever. But I see, and this is my big question, how on earth can we get it really more in the national framework? You say we are not interfering there. In our case, dealing with a very sensitive topic like history, citizenship and heritage, we are asked by our members to interfere and to bring examples or work what can help them improving or even fighting all sort of problematic issues. But how can we really make sure that there is a better implementation? I would like to give one example and then I give it back to you. But for instance, in the Netherlands, there is now this big idea that we go for education standards for students who leave school 2032. And when the basic documents were produced by a very intelligent group, it came to my knowledge that there was hardly any of all these international documents used as reference. And there I feel, yes, we do so much, you do so much, I have been doing a lot, but I still feel it's too much in a certain group talking on an international level and too little implementation on a local, national level.
Thank you, Joke. And before I'm handing over to Haldis, I would add another question, if this is okay for you, Haldis. Yeah. And I'm also inviting other participants to post their questions in the meantime. Balázs, our colleague from Hungary, asks, so the dialogue between school teachers and adult educators has to be developed and promoted both in the context of professional development and in the focus of lifelong learning and education policy contexts to get adult learning and education integrated to mainstream educational discourses in international frames. So he believes that adult education can, Education International, can help this process to realize progress in the near future, also in associations like the International Council for Adult Education. So a comment from Balázs to add to the discussion. Over to you, Haldis.
Yeah, well, I very much agree in that comment, because I believe that we still have a way to go for everyone who works within education to see ourselves more or less as one community that need to speak to each other. And that means also learning from each other and communicating with each other. I think we have made some progress, like in the transition from early childhood into primary school, primary to secondary in some countries. Lesser perhaps to tertiary education, and definitely into higher education, that we need to communicate to understand the particular challenges in the different sectors of education, but also to learn from each other and to piggyback off each other's knowledge where that is relevant. Now, to Joke's comment, I'd just like to emphasize that even though I say that Education International can't intervene with national governments, our member organizations can. And we do definitely try to encourage them. In some countries, they have very well-developed systems of policy dialogue, not just social dialogue, but also policy dialogue, where they do have influence. They may not always get everything they want through, but they do have a certain influence. In other countries, less or so. It depends on tradition, on level of unionization, and so on. But also to emphasize that although we come at it from a collective view, our basis for all our policy is a rights-based perspective, which does have an individual focus, that it's an individual right to education. And if you embed either in collective agreements or in legislation in countries, also the individual right to lifelong learning, you are focusing on the individual. And so we believe the right is of the individual, but that many times we can achieve our goals by working together as a collective.
Yeah.
I would like to say, I think there's also been a question about the Council of Europe. And now I know there are people that have signed on that are not in Europe and may not know that much about the Council of Europe. But the Council of Europe, I think, have developed quite a lot of quite high quality documents that go within the area of human rights, of citizenship. They call it democratic citizenship, education, tolerance, all these elements. And they now have developed a framework for democratic competence and democratic culture, which is about being piloted. So I think definitely that the Council of Europe has a lot to offer, but in my opinion, unfortunately, aren't always good enough at getting what they have out to the regular teacher or the regular community out there. But there are institutions that are trying to support them. So there are other international documents out there. Briefly mentioning the OECD, which I think produces documents that governments in OECD countries tend to reference a lot. And if you compare how often they reference them compared to how often they reference documents from like the Council of Europe or even from UNESCO or from the UN, there's quite a difference here. So I think some of our challenge is getting this balanced out. Now, some of the documents from OECD are very good. Some is more about how they are used, because every government will have a political agenda and will use them for their agenda. But I strongly believe, now we've mentioned this with democratic competences, global citizenship or democratic citizenship, what we are seeing that is really the area beside climate change is the notion of democracy and how democracy should work on the ground and how to educate the individual in being able to be an active citizen in today's world, where some of us will say that democracy is eroding in many places. And I think that is one of, call it the soft skills we need to learn, but it's really a very hard skill to teach and to learn.
Thank you. Haldis, also talking about links to documents. Emma asks if the framework is linked only to goal 4 of the Agenda 2030 or it's also linked to the other goals.
But the framework itself isn't produced to link to one specific goal, although it in the introduction specifically mentions the teacher goal under goal 4, because that's the only where in the Sustainable Development Goals that you mentioned teachers. And since these are standards for teachers, that's why it has that as starting point. But the work of teachers is in education that is cross-cutting all the goals.
Thank you. I hope that answers the question. I'm sure it does. Sturla, who's very tempted to use Norwegian, tack. Is it really a trend to take shortcuts to be a teacher, as you say in your interview in the journal? Yeah.
I would say yes, when we look at this from a global perspective. That we have had very many countries that are far from reaching the goal of access to education for all, and then I'm talking about primary, secondary, where you have the absolute goal in the Sustainable Development Goals. have tried shortcuts of everything from 3-week courses in the summer to believing that they can replace teachers' training with technology. So and also as part of a privatization trend, if you want to make money off education in poorer countries, you really have to cut costs because you're not going to be able to put in very high fees. They can't afford to pay them. And then the costs you have to cut are the costs for teachers. You either have fewer teachers, you train them quicker, which means it's often would not meet the standards we believe they should be at university level. So we see many shortcuts to try to get the numbers to go in up. We also see a large use of contract teachers, which may be a short-term solution, but if you do not offer these teachers that you give contracts without having been trained teachers, and you have them in year after year without proper terms, without having a scheme in place to help them to upskill and attain the competences, and that would go as much in adult education too, that if you want people to work there over time and gain long-term skills, you need to invest in them. And that we see that there often is a little interest in. You rather employ someone for 1 year, then you can get rid of them and get someone new in that's just as cheap as the one you had last year, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yes. The next topic is looking at digitalization and technology, and also maybe Joke wants to come in here as well. So there was a question from Mel. If it comes to digitalization, do you have any digital tools in mind using for better communication between early school, primary, secondary, higher education and actors? And is there a community platform? While then Jivanta mentions that in her experience, a lot of adults who are returning to school have a fear of technology. In addition, some older professors also have a fear of using technology. Is that something you all see often in your countries? A lot of work with adult educators to help them overcome technology barriers and fears, because there are skills they will need as the world is utilizing technology more. So maybe Joke first and then Haldis, if this is okay? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, it was interesting to see the starting moment here that Haldis also needed support. And I think this is one of the issues which will recur all the time. We noticed that the story that teachers are behind with technology and that their students are better, that's one I have been hearing from the beginning. And I think that, yes, there is a need also, I would say, for each institute or whatever to help people with that. But the problem, of course, is that every time you have acquired skills, you have to learn again, because new issues come in, new requirements come in. But of course it is an issue, and we have to pay attention to it, because the danger is, and I see that quite often, that when we start using material and we have a screen and we have a link, and then all of a sudden it doesn't work. And so what you see is that otherwise people return every time back to the safe areas, what they know how to do, and that is done quite often in my subject, talking. So yes, we need to deal with that, but again, it is a general requirement for investment, and not to complain all the time that teachers are not helpful here. For my own organization, Euroclio, we have seen a very wonderful opportunity of the whole digitization, because when we started, there was a big requirement for a European and now probably a global history textbook. And of course that was not possible. But since 2007, we realized that the digital world would give enormous opportunities for this subject. So we invented a project which is called Historiana. And if you go there, you get an enormous amount of material resources to deal with history, citizenship, and heritage on a digital scale, so a digital level. So there is things happening, but of course the basic problem of using technology, or what we all do, I think, yeah, there is always a problem that the younger generation will be better but I believe then that schools really have to deal with that as a general task to deal with it, because you cannot, if you leave out this, it's bad, of course, and the teacher feels very uncomfortable, and of course the students feel unhappy that they have encountered this. And I think this is really also an issue that Haldis perhaps has a better sort of general approach to it. We at least offer opportunities for history people to use all sort of international resources and all sort of techniques dealing with history and the digital world.
Mm. So to respond to that, Joka, I think, teachers, or educators in all levels, we have to relate to the digital world. Yeah. And to look at also the enormous opportunities it opens for us with access to information, to access to people, to access to things we've never had before. Now, it isn't completely new with technology in education. Now, I'm not ancient, but I'm not young either. And I didn't learn anything about computers when I took my teacher's training, but very quickly working in the utmost north of Norway, we actually had one of the first teaching spheres the way we are doing it now online. Sound wasn't too good and it was delayed and so on. But, and look at the experience from Australia and the outbacks of reaching the people that live in more rural areas, that it opens up opportunities to reach groups you haven't been able to reach before. I think it's enormously important for some of those groups, specifically indigenous peoples around the world. And if they, in addition, then can build up curriculum based on their own culture, it makes, I've seen that the change it has made in some countries just to have access to a smartphone, that it changes your world of communication and opportunities to do things. But at the same time, there is the challenge of the digital divide. Well, we may sit here in more affluent countries with all kinds of technology, although we could wish for more in our education settings and so on. There are people around the world that then feel really left behind because they do not have the same opportunity. So it is also a challenge, an equality challenge here, that not everyone has access to all the opportunities that lie there, but it's definitely a topic for professional development for all teachers and educators to positively not only learn the technology of it, which I don't know all of, but positively reflect how can this improve my practice? How can this give better offer of education for my students or for other students? But also having, as I said, the beware. Because it's very easy to import materials that are not culturally relevant, that don't fit into your context, that you keep the professional teacher or educator as the one that decides which tool to use and when. Then I think it can be a great help.
But I think here also this whole literacy to use this digital world is very important.
Oh yes, and in this world of fake news, we definitely need people to know that it isn't beautiful, everything that pops up in your social media feed or on a Google search.
So, indeed. We cannot miss it out, but we really have to continue to prepare people to use it and to apply it in a responsible manner. But I totally agree, without that, you cannot imagine the world anymore. So.
Talking about literacy, that brings us to the next topic, and we have about 10 more minutes. So, and there are 3 questions so far. So, talking about literacy, Sula asks, how can we cope with the challenge of 700 million illiterate adults globally, if we claim that teachers should have the formal professional qualification to teach them? And speaking about adult education, a related question from Alex. It seems to me that the debate about lifelong learning in adult education has been quite often focusing on the necessity adults have to learn new skills to keep themselves relevant to the job market and continue to produce wealth. So he would like to hear from you too, if you think it should be interesting to expand this discussion to other stances as well, and if our focus should always be placed on this aspect of adult education professionalization. Who would like to start?
Could you elaborate the second question, because, and you said there was a third one, but
No, the third one we will tackle later. The second, because it's related to a different topic, Alex was speaking about the focus on adult education, the focus on new skills for the job markets and to continue to produce wealth, and to what extent or in which direction adult education and lifelong learning should go otherwise instead of focusing on the job market. The first question was focusing on literate adults globally.
okay.
Okay, which one of us should start?
Haldis, please start.
Yeah. Well, I think when it comes to the focus of adult education, now, first and foremost, I'm not an expert on adult education, but I would say there's not one answer to that question, but I think there has to be a mixture. If you only focus on reskilling and upskilling from a workplace perspective, you are narrowing the opportunities and the needs, in my mind. But some of the adult education or professional development, call it what you want, in different sectors will be quite narrow, because it's about renewing and upskilling something you already know. It can be on-the-job training. It can be many things. But coming from an educational tradition that builds on, let me say, the German Bildung, this word education can mean a lot of things, that has a view that is about educating the whole human being, we believe that most education should have a broader focus than very narrow, just for tomorrow and the skills you need for tomorrow. And I think the topic we just touched on, even how to function in a modern functioning democracy, for many adults, you almost need to be retrained. How do you deal with your feed on Facebook? Because we're older, the ones of us on Facebook, or on Twitter for that case. How do you deal with that feed? So having some areas that also do address things in society that are changing, like information and how we access it, how we process it, how we use it. I think that it's very valuable to have a broader focus on, and that all adult education that is connected to formal education and to end in an exam or anything definitely should have just this broader focus. When it comes to illiteracy around the world, which is a tragic situation, and I absolutely agree that it should be a priority to try to target all the illiterate adults that are out there as much as possible. I actually think that that also is a key to the next generations being educated, that you start with the parents, the grandparents, and that will also motivate down. I don't think there's one answer to that. I don't think we can manage it just with trained teachers. But I think it's extremely important that if you train people in a proper way to be able to do a job in working on literacy, that you support them in further developing their skills, because they will need professional development to further develop the work they're doing, and perhaps give them the opportunity to actually in the long run qualify, if you want to. We also in Education International do have cooperations with the NGOs where they work in the field with people who are not qualified teachers, on that we support them and they supporting the people in the field of upskilling and getting the opportunity to formally get their qualifications in the long run. So it's more about intent and long run and support, because it can be difficult teaching people to read and write to a level of literacy where it's functional.
Thank you. You okay?
Yeah, I mean, the first point, I think it's indeed an enormous task to address it, but I think there's two forms of this problem. In one is that people haven't had the opportunity to go to school. And I think that our current education system doesn't offer enough opportunities for people to come in schooling, in learning in a later phase, even not because they do not have the right qualifications to enter the formal system. And so they have no opportunity to get in, although they have other qualifications, which might already give them opportunities and whatever. But I think it's even more bad, in fact, that people come from schools, formal education, and still do not have the right skills. And I think their education has really a task to be much better in identifying why these issues occur and how we can manage mend them. Because that, I think, is really awful when I hear how many youngsters leave school with a very low level of literacy, in fact. But the other thing about adult learning, which is a bit more to my heart, and I said it already in my initial talk, I think there is a big issue that people themselves have to analyze why and what they would like to learn. And indeed, that is for jobs, and it's absolutely necessary. But I think also for the whole idea about where I am and where I go to. And that is already, I think, a part also for education, to learn people not only the sort of issues, but also really to reflect on where they are and where they would like to go. And yes, that means that it's about my work, but it's also about me as a person and working in society, being able, as we talked already, with the digitization of the world, etc. So I would very much like to see that, yes, adult education should be based on personal needs, but then person has to be more trained to be able to see where the interests and the opportunities are to go for lifelong learning, which is lovely and interesting. And I can say, as an elderly person, every day is still learning.
We all do, Joke. So we are going to be wrapping up now with a final question from Miguel Silva. It's focused on challenges, maybe not the most, well, maybe we can turn it into a positive ending. So positive answers to challenges Miguel mentions. So he sees that nowadays it's the lack of adequate working conditions for formal educators, having to deal with heavy programs, huge and different learning groups, heavy administrative work, and little incentive. All, of course, is at the expense of the pedagogical role of the educator. So both of you, as a final note, yeah, how do you see these challenges being tackled in a positive way in the future?
I would say that, yes, I think that the role of an educator is not easy. And to be honest, I don't believe it's ever been very easy. But I think that the positive, and it was also mentioned by Haldis in her article, that there is much more interest at the moment for the role of the educator and the importance of an educator. And I think this is something we really can use and see that people realize that we have had a period that teachers were only sort of coaches or whatever. And by now people really quite overall start to realize that a teacher makes a difference and can really make a difference for society in the future. So I would say, yes, it's not an easy job, but on the other hand, I think also that there's hardly a more rewarding job than being a teacher. And also that, despite all the troubles and whatever, I would say it's something that you have to go for. But just be happy that there is now interest, more interest than 10, 15 years ago. You could really see that. And let's hope that that pays out and that people really realize that they have to be careful. And the good example of Finland is one where you can see that, yes, if society celebrates teachers, they get something in return.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, and of course I would, coming from where I come, I thought that it was a very good summary of the challenges that the teaching profession and other educators meet. And of course, coming from the trade union movement, my answer is the only way to take on those challenges is to do it collectively. And that if you organize, and it's not a quick fix, and some of our member organizations, they lose battles, but in between they win some of them. And it's also about having a trade union and organizing collectively. You also can move away some of the focus of doing that battle from the professional work and let people do it for you. So you're doing it together, you are stronger. and you can focus on your professional life. But yes, it is a real challenge. And professionally, I'm very worried about countries that keep making the working conditions less attractive, both from a professional perspective, which moving more of the work over to bureaucratic reporting and so on, instead of the classroom work, but also in remuneration and working hours, number of students and so on. You're not going to recruit. The future teachers and young people won't be interested in that kind of work because, you know, they are young independent professionals. So you have to make the profession attractive. But I do believe, and I want to end with that you have to keep in mind, because I agree with you, that it has its challenges, but it is a beautiful profession. And we have some opportunities and some golden moments, I'm sure all of us through our life, where we've made an impact on others through our profession. And that is also citing a world leader that I don't need to give the name of, that once said to me, you know, you can take everything away from a human being, but you can't take away their education.
Yep. Agree. Yeah, you're gone.
We lost Ricarda's sound. She's muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
So,
where am I? I'm back.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yes.
I lost you. Thank you so much for both of you for this very inspiring and passionate inputs. It was really, yeah, we could feel how enthusiastic you are about the work you're doing. And yeah, I would like to thank you so much. And would also mention these links. I hope you can see them all. Joke has forwarded 2 links to me beforehand. One is from the EU Key Competences for Lifelong Learning, and the other one, Competences for Democratic Culture. You will receive the PowerPoint presentation afterwards from myself, but also from Haldis. So you will all have these links available, as well as the recording. Also, you will receive from me a feedback form. I would be delighted to hear what you thought about the webinar, and would like to hear how we can improve. So very, very grateful for the feedback you're giving us. And yes, and also I'm inviting you to stay tuned and join our other webinars. I'm including here just the links from Bridge 47. You can become a member of the Bridge 47 network, sign up to our newsletters, follow us on all this kind of new technology like Twitter and Facebook. And as mentioned, this webinar is based on the Adult Education and Development Journal, which has been published since 1973. And unfortunately, this is the very last version and the very last edition of this journal due to financial reasons. And so we're very sad about it, but of course you can read all the past editions, 54 editions, on the website, and you can order printed copies from our colleagues at DVV International as well. So this was the administrative final words. And yeah, I would like to say thank you very much again to Haldis and Joke. It was so lovely to have you with us today, very inspiring. Thanks for your passion and thanks for your enthusiasm, and I'm looking forward to be meeting you in person, hopefully very soon again. And thanks to all the other participants as well, and looking forward to see you at the next webinar. Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Success and bye.
Bye-bye.